So the Swahili Coast of Eastern Africa figures prominently in pictorial remains of European colonization and empire making. Today, photo archives across the world continue to catalog, disseminate, and display thousands of images like these. Pictures and descriptions of Swahili men and women have long ignited the imagination of Europeans and Americans because they evoke a much-loved phantasm of exotic women, ruthless slavers, and languid harem girls, and mysterious hybrid races. This is part of the European imaginary. Especially studio women and postcards depicting Swahili women circulated all across the Western world during the colonial period, when the coast was part of the British Protectorate, roughly 1890 to 1963. Most show young girls in contrived poses, meeting the eye of the viewer either with suggestive stares or with a bright smile. Indeed, it is these type of women and photographs that have been the focus of scholarly analysis. Now, before I continue, I just want to orient you to the Swahili Coast, although many people in this room have done research on the Swahili Coast, so know the area quite well. But in general, the Swahili Coast is understood to be at the edge of overlapping ecosystems, and Swahili cities have been nodes of transoceanic connectivity for over a millennium. The diverse peoples who came to be known as the Swahili, after the Arabic word for edge or boundary, created a unique mercantile culture along this narrow coastal region of what is now Kenya and Tanzania. The diverse people who living on the Swahili Coast or in Swahili Coast port towns and cities whose economic livelihood depended on managing the long-distance trade between inland Africa and the Western Indian Ocean have long been primary traders. And in fact, as you shall see, one of the primary exotic imports consumed, transformed, and even reinvented on the Swahili Coast was photography and portraiture. Certainly, much has been written about how such photographs, that is colonialist photographs, relate to the colonial gaze and the violence of objectification. Photography endowed racist discourse with the power of the real, and claims about the essential differences between colonizer and colonized were anchored in photographic representation. But the representational protocols of photography can, of course, be deployed for diverse ends. While photography was and is a technology of empire, it is also a technology of self, a site of embodied experience. That is, photographs are very much artifacts that hold on to people's lived experiences and memories. After all, the reality effect of photography that is somehow connected to the bodies in the photograph can materialize a person's presence, however mediated and spectral, especially if one focuses on the sitter in the photograph. Then photography's documentary and social aspects come into focus. Indeed, scholars of the Global South, those regions that, of the world that experience colonization, have been at the forefront of exploring the realist effects of photography, connecting the study of photography to themes of social and political struggle, everyday experience, and modernity. For example, Africanists, which I am one myself, have in the past presented photos like these that you see here as powerful icons that reveal the sitter's agency and selfhood. That is, Africanists focus on the figuration and bodies. and interpret the poses and gazes of the subjects as signs of their personality and inner life. Now, let me give you a brief historical overview of photography in East Africa. Photographs first became locally available probably in the 1870s or 80s, arriving as exotic imports via the mercantile networks that have long connected the Swahili Coast cities to other trade hubs across the Western Ocean. In fact, before European colonization, Swahili Coast residents avidly collected photographs, especially in the form of carte de visites and postcards like these in their homes. For example, this postcard once belonged to a member of the ruling Busaidi dynasty. Zanzibar was annexed into the Busaidi Sultanate Oman in the 1830s, and East Africa was also colonized by the Omani Sultanate. The first carte de visite that you see an example here and pictorial chromolithographs were sold in Zanzibari markets with other South Asian imports, such as textiles, housewares, and decorative ornament, destined for the realm of bodily display or to beautify interiors. And this postcard was originally produced in Lisbon and sent to Zanzibar via Goa. Now, Goa here is not incidental, because Goans opened the first commercial photography studio in Zanzibar and Mombasa already in the 1870s, which you see examples of here. Often their studios were also shops selling all kinds of cheap commodities. Although it is often assumed that Goan photographers came directly from India to Zanzibar, many had been living, in fact, in other ports with significant European populations. Gomez, who you see here, and his family migrated from Aden to Zanzibar sometime in the 1870s, precisely as British interests in the Indian Ocean were shifting from the coastal towns of the Arabian Peninsula to the Swahili Coast. They produced portraits for clients, but also kept large stocks of carte de visites of famous personages, album and prints, and picture postcards of quote-unquote native studies. In fact, the images that I showed you at the beginning, the colonialist images, were in fact produced by Goan photographers for European consumers. So the exoticizing gaze that we often associate with European desires were often manufactured by South Asian photographers to meet those desires. So clearly South Asian photographers at first primarily catered to Europeans living on the Swahili Coast. Yet soon after opening their shops, the local population embraced portrait photography. Especially wealthy Omani Arabs, but also Swahili patricians enjoyed visiting Goan studios, or if royal, ordering the photographer to come to the palace, as you see on the right in the PowerPoint. But it is striking that photography on the Swahili Coast did not connect to pre-existing local traditions of pictorial representation or portraiture. Despite the absence of such traditions, the pleasure of looking at, touching, and sharing photographs was a pastime instantly embraced by locals. Late 19th and early 20th century sources suggest that consuming photographs, that is by locals, was considered a playful and tasteful pastime, one that was intimately connected to one's ability to craft spaces of tasteful sophistication. One British visitor described one patrician's sitting room as, and here I quote, a tawdry horror because it was filled with hundreds of cheap pictures and portraits of our kings and queens, typical of the poor taste that prevails when African when Africans reject their own culture for our modern culture. And of course, in the written narratives produced by Europeans, they're always outraged that the Swahili Coast residents so easily appropriate what they think, what Europeans think of their culture. But this interest in collecting and displaying overseas things was not a recent phenomenon on the Swahili Coast. Rather, imported objects fulfilled an ancient desire for signs and objects that visualized mobility, exchange, and the means to make the exotic one's own. It was a local tradition for women to stage elaborate assemblages of imported things, giving material form to the traveling cultures of the Swahili Coast. During the height of the 19th century economic boom, cheaper and new commodities flooded the market, which also in part gave new life to old ways of consuming the world. For example, you see here, Chinese porcelain was a desired import on the Swahili Coast since the 14th century, and this consumption increased with the economic boom and industrialization in the 19th century. This interior features a range of imported objects, including US mechanical wall clocks, porcelain dishes, French mirrors, Indian beds, gas lamps, chromolithographs of Arabic calligraphy. This is also the earliest documentation of how locals presented photographs and other pictorial works during the late 19th century in their homes. A series of framed photographs of people, the outlines of heads and bodies just barely visible in the pictures, decorate the walls and columns of this sitting room. Further, large gilded frames, only their lower sections discernible, filled with lithographs of landscapes and portraits, hang high above the heads of the 5 men seated in the center of the room. Other objects, especially porcelain dishes, encircle the pictures and photographs. Here, the photographs are not presented as singular objects, rather they work in tandem with other objects to create a sense of teeming surfaces. In contrast to Lamu residents, so this image is from Lamu, which is a port city in the northern region of Kenya, Zanzibaris, which you see an example of here, displayed photographs in slightly different ways. Here, studio photographs are a very central element of the room's design program. 3 large mounted and framed portraits of men in Omani dress are displayed on the ornate Indo-Portuguese cabinet in the right foreground of the image, and another occupies the small nightstand next to the bed. Each photograph is a distinct thing, not just an element in a larger mass of other objects. This sitting room at the British Residency in Zanzibar illustrates the similarity between the display of photography in the homes of the Arab elite and Europeans living in Zanzibar or in Mombasa, an example seen here. Just like in the Omani man's room, here too photographs are staged as distinct objects of display, either hung on the room's wall or placed on tables and shelves. These photographs were not just bought in the market or acquired for their exotic objectness. Rather, they are portraits, keepsakes, and mementos of family members. In many ways, this room and the previous one, of course, are also distinctly British domestic spaces, where the framed picture speak to notions of Victorian homemaking and middle-class self-fashioning. But these rooms share strikingly similar attributes, including the Zanzibari one. They were all Baroque displays of ornament, cluttered with so much furniture and bric-a-brac that the overall effect was one of sensuous surfaces. Consuming and collecting masses of objects, including photographs, and here's an example in Goa, and another one from Mombasa, was a passion shared across diverse communities connected by the networks of the Indian Ocean. Yet, it is important to point out that similarity does not necessarily mean that these extravagant displays were part of only one system of signification, and affinity, that is, or similarity, does not mean equivalence. While the framing and display of photographs in these spaces is related, each assemblage, each individual photograph likely also meant different things to the different people using these spaces. Certainly, Swahilis and Arabs collecting and displaying photographs probably had little interest in reproducing European notions of Victorian propriety, for example. So, what happened when locals looked into the picture? In fact, now I want to focus on their significance as portraits, that is, focusing on the bodies in these photographs. But portraits, but in a different sense, that is, portraits that are constituted by a seriality and superficial quality. Now, scholars often assume that people, especially the poor or colonized, wanted portrait photographs of themselves to be seen as emblems of their individuality. This assumption has a long tradition in mainstream photographic theory. For example, Susan Sontag, quote, said, "Facing the camera signifies solemnity, frankness, the disclosure of the subject's essence," end of quote. But as Alan Trachtenberg and his work reminds us, alternative understandings of photography also existed, especially during its early history. According to him, the spectral quality of the photographic portrait suggested to some 19th century viewers that photographic images manifest a temporary, unreal, and contingent identity. The contingency of likeness and identity is exactly what Swahili Coast residents cultivated in their engagement with photographic portraits. Swahili Coast residents certainly knew how to look beyond the surface, so to speak, into the perspectival depths of the photograph. But it is my argument that during the 19th century, it was nevertheless consumed primarily as a generic object, as part of a genre. Especially when printed and framed as a carte de visite, so very small calling cards that you could exchange, the photograph presented the subject as a traveling, transferable, and interchangeable type. The physical qualities of carte de visites, their sturdy format, small size, further heightened their serial quality, allowing them to travel with relative ease across great distances and between different communities. Sultan Bargash, who you see in both of these carte de visites, was the first Swahili Coast resident who used the photograph as a genre of long-distance communication. He embraced its formulaic seriality as a tool of persuasion and diplomacy, orchestrating the circulation of photographs and mass-produced images of himself across various publics. For example, he proudly reprinted engravings based on photographs published in the Illustrated London News of his public appearances when he toured Europe in 1875 and kept a scrapbook of those images and showed them regularly to his guests. He also commissioned these carte de visites that you see here of himself from the most fashionable photography studio in London. This studio, that is Mal and Company, specialized in serving social and political elites of England, including members of the British Parliament. Once Bargash returned to Zanzibar, he would present these carte de visites as gifts to Europeans and that is visitors and European residents in Zanzibar. Barghash also included signed carte de visites of himself in diplomatic missives, at least in those written to Europeans. For example, his carte de visite seen on the left accompanied his letter to Roger Price, a British missionary. This letter entreated Price to remind powerful politicians that it was he, that is Barghash, who made their work, that is colonization, in Central Africa possible. By the 1880s, European accounts are filled with stories about being presented signed carte de visites at the conclusion of their audiences with the sultans and other powerful locals in Zanzibar. Not surprisingly, almost all public portraits of this time period are formulaic, with backdrops and poses that could be found in many places across the globe. As can be seen in Barghash's picture here on the left, he holds his body according to established codes of portrait photography, resting his hands on a standard studio prop. Also, all coastal men consistently wore only Omani ceremonial garb, seen here, for their official portraits, which, as we shall see, is not always how they dressed or held their bodies in portraits meant for local circulation. But carte de visites effectively worked as tokens of likeness because they transformed people into commensurate objects, prompting recognition through its generic qualities, fulfilling the expectation of viewers. Certainly Barghash hoped that his letter and signed carte de visite would compel Price to like him, to remember his social debt, and therefore to lobby on Barghash's behalf in London. But the photograph in general, as also seen here, was not meant to create an affecting reciprocal bond or even a sense of deep intercultural connectedness. Rather, such pictures expressed a surface similitude. The photographic subject only gained a circumscribed visibility as a node in a series of thousands of carte de visites circulating across the globe during this period. Now, a few rare private portraits suggest that people of means and the colonial elite also very much enjoyed simply playing with the exotic poses and fashions that they saw in pictures of distant others. Converted into an image, bodily surfaces became tangible things that could be tried on for one's own performance in front of the camera. Now, in a longer version of this paper, I also discuss women's portraits, which also raise important issues of gender and power, but now I only want to briefly introduce you to these two photographs. The one on the right is of a young Ali al-Busaidi, who would become Sultan of Zanzibar in 1902, and the man on the left in the picture on the left is Mbarak Hinawi, who will become the governor of Mombasa in 1936. Mbarak shared the photo session with two other unidentified males, a toddler sitting on the chair in the center, who's clearly not holding still, and another young man who is similarly dressed and posed as Mbarak. These photographs present the young men as stylish and carefree dandies, flaneurs par excellence. Mbarak and Ali also are leaning on their walking sticks, standing in a jaunty contrapposto position, and wearing pressed suits imported from overseas. Ali is particularly confident in his stylish posturing. His shirt collar is starched to stiff perfection, and he puffs out his chest with self-confidence. These portraits certainly express a playful self-projection. Of course, on one level, they are signaling their familiarity and engagement with European cultures and fashions. But these are images that represent a theatrical playfulness. the sitters are embracing the artifice of the photographic encounter, temporarily playing and engaging clothes and postures that were in fact not part of their daily life, although certainly part of their life. The Hinawi photograph on the left was taken at one of the many Goan photo studios located in the busy commercial heart of Mombasa Old Town during the 1920s and 30s. Interestingly, the ragged edges of the painted backdrop and its pulley system are very much visible in the background of the image. This imbues the photograph, the portrait, with an idiosyncratic, even provincial character. Certainly the studio's worn props signals Mombasa's distance from places such as Bombay and London, where standardized norms of portraiture were more strictly followed, and studio props could be more easily replaced. But the fact that the image was not cropped also suggests that sitters perhaps also desired a theatrical effect. That is, while the tattered quality of the props were certainly not wanted, the inclusion of the mechanics of the theatrics of the studio in the portrait further enhances the artifice of the photographic encounter. The photographic portrait also gave locals a new medium through which to present the aestheticized body, making temporary acts of self-adornment and comportment into permanent things. When elite men dressed and posed for portraits that commemorated important religious ceremonies, they presented themselves to the camera using locally established codes of performance, holding their bodies as if they were in fact in the space of the ceremony. For example, the portrait on the left likely is a wedding portrait of an unidentified resident of Old Town, Mombasa. The glass plate negative of this photograph is still in a local family collection in Mombasa, although the sitter's identity is no longer known. And it was likely taken in the 1910s when it was common for grooms, but not brides, to visit a local studio to have their photograph taken wearing their wedding costume, which for men of means was Omani ceremonial garb. In such wedding portraits, the subjects are often presented enthroned in a local crafted kidicha enzi, or throne of agency and power, the same type of chair used to display the groom and the bride for the viewing pleasure of wedding guests on the last day of marriage celebrations. In the photographic restaging of such events, the body of the sitter is always frontally oriented towards the camera, and the body takes on an expansive position. Legs are spread and feet are firmly planted on the ledge or floor. This posture was symbolically significant on the Swahili Coast. It indicates belonging to the Mwangwana class, the freeborn patricians of East and Central Africa. In fact, the earliest photographs of noble Swahili men and women show them enthroned, presenting their bodies in this position of power. Elders also describe the poise and composure of such patricians as they sat stiffly erect for hours upon a kidicha enzi, ever vigilant and in command of the bodies of others. The ability to stage oneself enthroned, wearing fine clothes, was itself a performance of autonomous personhood. Finally, the group portrait on the right, which is still in a family's personal collection in Mombasa, is said to represent Sheikh Selim and his son, who both are seated with legs astride and hands on their knees. According to his great-grandson, Selim first moved to Zanzibar and then Mombasa from Oman in the 1880s to take part in the burgeoning caravan trade. Family tradition says that it was taken, that is this photograph, to commemorate an Eid holiday, and that all the people surrounding the seated men are enslaved workers or bondsmen. Photography also gave new life to ancient practices of objectifying the body, that is, local practices of objectifying the body, in which persons were forced to act as ornaments, as pleasing tableaux vivants of wealth and power. This is aptly demonstrated in a group portrait, also once in the Busaidi family collection, which shows the future sultan as a child accompanied by two men. The one standing stiffly behind him and staring directly into the camera is likely one of his brothers or another close family relative. He and the young Ali are wearing Omani dress. Yet the most extravagantly dressed person in the photograph is the man whose body is turned sideways, his gaze and attention intently focused on Ali. His robe is fashioned from a paisley-patterned brocade, an expensive and much prized import from South Asia. But his rich clothes are not emblems of his own status or good taste. He is an attendant bonded to the royal family, indicated by his bare feet, which are just visible here. He is an ornament, a visual cue to signal the sultanate and the many bodies it commands. To control and amass such ornately dressed bodies signaled taste and the ability to consume commodities, including in its human form. This man's body, although at rest, is still fundamentally a laboring body. He's doing aesthetic work as a pictured body and as an armature for the presentation of exotic textiles in the picture. In fact, many African economies imported textiles. Many African economies imported textiles where they acted as a form of currency in transcontinental systems of exchange. And from the African perspective, the value of textiles was intimately linked to the value of people. Throughout the slave trade, the African value of the enslaved was calculated as pieces of imported textiles. On the Swahili Coast, cloth was also one of the most important imports because it was an exchangeable and highly mobile thing, perfectly encapsulating transoceanic connectivity and mercantile plenitude. Swahilis also coveted imported textiles because they could be used to create networks of dependence. Amassing people as clients, enslaved or bonded persons through a body politic in which the ability to amass and distribute imported cloth to vassals affected one's ability to rule and command others. This photograph therefore speaks to this long tradition of using textiles in rituals of gifting, but it is also my argument that it also enacts its modern reinvention. The photograph functions as an image and an object, and as such, it allowed locals to present people as things in new ways. It was also during this period that imported cloth and enslaved people became increasingly affordable, and people came to function as things of conspicuous consumption. In fact, historians have recently argued that the trading boom of the second half of the 19th century, when the Swahili Coast was absorbed into the North Atlantic economic sphere, led to the commodification of daily life in many profound ways. The unprecedented intensification of the slave trade beginning in the late 1700s and the rise of plantation slavery on the Swahili Coast in the 1800s forever changed local social relations. The categorical equation of enslaved humans with wealth and luxury very much informed local notions about the nature of being cultured and what it means to be civilized. Even as enslaved Africans labored under extreme harsh conditions outside the city on plantations, in the city, the display of the non-laboring aestheticized body became increasingly important. Their use value was now not set in motion as labor on a plantation, but rather their bodies were recast as an aesthetic armature for their owner's performance of wealth. In fact, the display of household bonded persons became the most important sign of leisured luxury during this period, since their owner did not depend on them as laborers. But literally, their ornamented bodies and fashionably dressed bodies were pleasing performances of wealth. There even existed a category of bonded or servant woman called wapambe, meaning the ornamented ones. Sumptuously dressed in the most imported expensive silks and cottons, they would accompany patricians at various public festivals and processions, the mass of their bedecked and bejeweled bodies transforming the spaces of the city into a spectacle of wealth and luxury. A very unusual photograph, which belonged once to the Busaidi family, suggests that locals very much understood the logic of objectifying people into photographic things. Such photographs, although also likenesses, are primarily about intensifying the effect of surface ornament. This photograph shows 6 barefooted wapambe posing on the exterior veranda of the Sultan's palace, to whom they and the palace belonged. Each is sheathed in a different kanga cloth, their bodies creating a play of arabesque-like graphics along the length of the floriated cast iron balustrade behind them. The photographic effect further reduces their bodies to a play of surfaces. The women's bodies and subjectivities are displaced by the surface of the photograph, further heightening the material qualities, the form of the photographic screen. These young women had objecthood imposed on them, and through the photograph, they are forever giving material form to other people's concepts of the beautiful, aesthetic, and exotic. In conclusion, then, on the Swahili Coast, photographs often worked as things, colliding with other things such as bodies, commodities, and heirlooms, creating ornamented surfaces in people's homes, for example, as we saw at the beginning. As we have seen, for early consumers, photographs were tantalizingly opaque, endowed with a foreign materiality that made them perfect artifacts of display and pleasure. In fact, the foreignness of the photographic artifact was essential to local residents. Its distancing aesthetics was what made it interesting. The Swahili Coast, therefore, offers a different genealogy for understanding the beginnings of popular uses of photography in Africa. While scholars tend to critique the reductive uses of photography, its ability to obscure interiority, Swahili Coast residents in fact embraced this aspect. Ultimately, this also suggests that we should not always assume that photographic portraiture in Africa is always a serious self-expression. Instead, photographic practice was often very much about play, the superficial, and exteriority. Certainly on the Swahili Coast, photographs were folded into very old practices, traditions that were primarily about haptic pleasure of beautiful objects and the politics of objectification. Further, while we often want to see locality or cultural difference when we study photography in places often categorized as non-Western, Swahili Coast surface effects were not a stylistic feature or formal aspect of the photographic image. Instead, it was a way of doing things with photographs. The surface effect of photography allowed locals to heighten a series of ancient practices, practices that are primarily about the aesthetic experience of objects, their textures, and the sensual qualities of the exotic and far away. These surface effects, in fact, constituted the making of a new aesthetic, through which the difference between sentient beings and things became less clear. In a sense, then, this photograph reveals how photography was used to heighten the ornamental effects of bodies, creating a series of striking surface equivalences between bodies, objects, and ornament. When we look at African photographic practices and juxtapose them to photographs of Africans taken for European audiences, an example again that I showed you earlier and again now here on the left, they do indeed trouble and challenge colonialist forms of knowing, and there is in fact a significant cultural difference between these two photographs. But both were also in many ways about dehumanization. I think there's many significances, and the one that I, of course, focused on is the rise of ways of objectifying human beings and the impact of industrialization and the complex ways. There are many layers of colonialization and empire building at work here. So from the political perspectives, you have a huge increase of migration from Central Africa to the coast, and you have a huge increase of massive diasporic communities shifting all over the Zanzibar and other main port cities, and we usually can think of that in a celebratory way, that you have this making of these complex, beautiful, cosmopolitan cities, which in fact you do. But of course, the darker side of the rise of cosmopolitan and very globally connected modern port cities is that it has to do also with the objectification and the reduction of peoples into commodities, and you have a rise of the circulation of enslaved Africans, right? So that's maybe something you would be more interested in. But in general, for the cultural history of the Swahili Coast and relationship to the Indian Ocean, what you see here is the intensification and transformation of very old networks of cultural connectivity that span Central Africa all the way across the ports of India.